On a Thursday morning in March of 1974 in Sumner County, Kansas, a 17-year-old girl named Emma Dawson buried her father. Robert Dawson was 46 years old when the tractor rolled. He'd been clearing a ditch on the North 40, working alone like he always did, when the ground gave way beneath the rear wheel. The farm all went over, and Robert went with it. By the time a neighbor found him, he'd been dead for hours. Emma was the one who identified the body. Her mother, Grace, was too sick to leave the house, had been too sick for 3 years, ever since the cancer started eating away at her strength. There was no one else. Robert and Grace had only one child, and that child was a daughter. The funeral was small. The Methodist church, the family cemetery behind the farmhouse, a handful of neighbors who came as much out of curiosity as sympathy. Everyone knew the Dawson situation. Everyone knew what came next. They came to the farmhouse after the burial, carrying casseroles and condolences and something else offers. The first was from Vernon Cross, who farmed the section north of the Dawson place. He pulled Emma aside while her mother rested in the bedroom. "Emma, honey, I'm real sorry about your daddy. He was a good man." "Thank you, Mr. Cross. Now I know this isn't the time to talk business, but you're going to have to think about the future." Vernon's voice dropped to what he probably thought was a fatherly tone. "That farm's too much for a girl to handle alone. Your mama's sick, you've got no brothers, no husband. The merciful thing would be to sell while the land's worth something." Emma looked at him. She'd known Vernon Cross her whole life, had sat in Sunday school with his children, had eaten at his table, had watched him borrow equipment from her father, and never quite get around to returning it. "I'm not selling," she said. Vernon blinked. "Now, Emma, I said I'm not selling. The farm was my father's. Now it's mine. I'm going to work it." Vernon's expression shifted from sympathy to something else, something that might have been amusement. "Emma, you're 17 years old. You're a girl. Farming isn't women's work. It's hard, dangerous, back-breaking labor. Your daddy knew that. It's what killed him. My daddy taught me to drive a tractor when I was 12. He taught me to plow, to plant, to harvest. He taught me everything he knew because—" Emma's voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. "Because he said if anything ever happened to him, I needed to be able to take care of things. That's different. That was helping out. Running a farm by yourself is something else entirely. Then I'll learn the rest." Vernon shook his head, the amusement becoming more obvious. 3 months. That's my prediction. 3 months. And you'll be begging someone to take that land off your hands." He walked away, leaving Emma standing alone in her own kitchen. But Vernon wasn't the only one with an offer. Let me tell you about the John Deere dealer, because he was the worst of them. His name was Clyde Haskell, and he'd driven out from Wellington the day after the funeral. He pulled into the Dawson farmyard in his dealership truck, saw Emma working on the tractor her father had died beside, and got out with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Dawson, I'm Clyde Haskell, from Haskell Equipment in Wellington. I wanted to express my condolences about your father." Emma wiped her hands on a rag and said nothing. "I also wanted to make you an offer." Clyde gestured at the farmall. "That tractor there, it's what, a 51 Super C? 23 years old. I could give you $400 for it, as a favor to your father's memory. That's more than it's worth, frankly, but I know times are hard. The tractor's not for sale." Clyde's smile tightened. "Miss Dawson, Emma, let me be honest with you. You're a young girl. You've got a sick mother to care for. The kindest thing you can do for yourself is to sell this farm, sell the equipment, and move somewhere you can get a job. A secretary, maybe, or a school teacher. Something appropriate. Appropriate for a woman." "Yes." Clyde spread his hands. "Farming isn't for women. It never has been. Your father was a good man, but he made a mistake not having sons. Now you're paying the price for that mistake." Emma felt something hot rise in her chest. It wasn't grief. She'd cried all her tears at the funeral. This was something else, something that felt like her father's voice in her head, saying the words he'd said 100 times. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do, Emma. Not even me." "Mr. Haskell," she said, keeping her voice steady, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to remember it. I am not selling this farm. I am not selling this tractor. I am going to work this land the way my father worked it, and his father before him, and if you or anyone else has a problem with that, you can get off my property." Clyde's smile vanished entirely. "You're making a mistake, little girl. A big mistake. When you come crawling to me in 3 months begging me to buy that piece of junk, I'll give you 200. Maybe?" He got in his truck and drove away without looking back. Emma watched him go, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. Then she turned back to the tractor, picked up her wrench, and got back to work. Now let me tell you about the first year, because that's when Emma learned what she was made of. Spring 1974. Emma Dawson was 17 years old, alone on 160 acres, with a sick mother who needed care and a community that expected her to fail. She planted wheat, not because it was the best choice, but because it was what her father had always planted, and she knew how to do it. She drove the farm all from dawn to dusk, plowing and disking and planting, learning as she went, making mistakes and fixing them. The neighbors watched, some with curiosity, some with pity, some with that smirking amusement that Vernon Cross had shown at the funeral. They were waiting for her to fail. They had bets on how long she'd last. 3 months, Vernon had said. 3 months came and went. Emma was still farming. The wheat grew. Not perfectly. Emma made mistakes with the fertilizer, misjudged the timing on some of the fields, but it grew. And in July she harvested it herself, driving the combine her father had bought used in 1968, learning its quirks and moods the way she'd learned the tractor. Her yield was below average. Her profits were thin. But she had a crop, and she had money in the bank, and she was still on her land. The neighbors stopped smirking quite so openly. Let me tell you about Grace, because she matters to this story. Emma's mother had been sick since 1971. Ovarian cancer that the doctors in Wichita had tried to treat and failed. By 1974, Grace Dawson was confined to bed most days, too weak to help with the farm, barely strong enough to help with herself. Some nights, Emma would come in from the fields, exhausted and filthy, and find her mother crying. "I'm sorry," Grace would say. "I'm sorry I can't help you. I'm sorry you have to do this alone." Emma would sit on the edge of her mother's bed and take her hand. "You're not a burden, Mama. You're why I'm doing this. You could sell the farm. Take me somewhere easier. California, maybe, somewhere warm." "And do what? Be a secretary?" Emma smiled. "I'm a farmer, Mama. That's what Daddy raised me to be. I'm not going to run away just because some men think I can't handle it." Grace looked at her daughter, this fierce, stubborn girl who had somehow become a woman without anyone noticing. "Your father would be so proud of you." "I know." Emma squeezed her mother's hand. "That's why I can't quit." Grace Dawson died in the winter of 1976. 2.5 years after her husband, Emma buried her in the family cemetery, next to Robert, and stood alone in the snow as the last of the mourners drove away. She was 19 years old. She had no parents, no siblings, no husband. She had 160 acres, a 25-year-old tractor, and a community that was still waiting for her to fail. She kept farming. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been completely alone? Not just lonely, but alone. No one to call for help, no one to share the burden, no one who would come if you cried out in the night. Emma Dawson was alone. For 13 years after her mother died, she worked that farm by herself. Planting, harvesting, maintaining equipment, fixing fences, handling livestock, everything a farmer does, she did. Alone. She never married. There were men who showed interest, young farmers from neighboring counties, men who saw her land more clearly than they saw her, but Emma turned them all down. "I'm not looking for a husband," she told one persistent suitor. "I'm looking for someone who sees me, not my acres. Until I find that, I'll take care of myself." She took care of herself for a long time. Now let me tell you about the bet, because that's the part everyone in Sumner County still talks about. In the summer of 1979, 5 years after Robert Dawson's death, Vernon Cross and Clyde Haskell found themselves drinking at the same bar in Wellington. The subject of Emma Dawson came up, as it often did. 5 years, Vernon said, shaking his head. I gave her 3 months. I was wrong. She's stubborn, Clyde agreed. I'll give her that. But stubborn doesn't mean successful. She's barely scraping by out there. She's scraping by better than some. Vernon took a drink. You hear about the Thompson place? Banks foreclosing. Times are tough. Clyde shrugged. That's what happens when you take on too much debt. Emma Dawson doesn't have any debt. Clyde raised an eyebrow. What? No debt. 0. I asked at the bank. That girl has never borrowed a dime. Pays for everything in cash. Vernon laughed bitterly. She's farming like it's 1950. No expansion, no modernization, no loans. Just her and that old farmall, doing things the hard way. That's why she's barely scraping by. Or that's why she'll still be farming when the rest of us are bankrupt. Clyde snorted. You think? You think that little girl is going to outlast real farmers? I think she might outlast you. Clyde's face went red. That's ridiculous. I've got the biggest dealership in 3 counties. I'm selling more equipment than ever, on credit, to farmers who are borrowing to pay for it. Vernon finished his drink. What happens when the interest rates go up? What happens when the prices go down? What happens when all those farmers can't make their payments? That won't happen. It always happens. Sooner or later, it always happens. Vernon stood up. Tell you what, Clyde. 5 years from now, 1984, we'll see who's still standing. You with your big dealership and all your loans, or that stubborn girl with her paid-off farm and her antique tractor. Is that a bet? Vernon smiled. Sure. 5 years. Loser buys dinner. They shook on it. Neither of them would ever eat that dinner. Let me tell you about 1984, because that's when the wheel turned. The farm crisis didn't arrive with a single moment of catastrophe. It crept in slowly, interest rates climbing, commodity prices falling, land values collapsing. By 1984, the disaster was undeniable. Farmers who had borrowed to expand found themselves owing more than their land was worth. Banks that had eagerly extended credit were now desperately calling it in. Equipment dealerships that had sold tractors on easy terms were repossessing machines they couldn't resell. Vernon Cross lost his farm in the spring of 19... He'd borrowed to buy the Thompson place, the same place he'd mentioned at the bar in 1970. Emma Dawson bought 40 of his acres at the foreclosure auction. She paid cash. Vernon was there, watching his land sold off piece by piece. When Emma's hand went up for the bid, their eyes met across the auction yard. Emma didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just nodded. Once, and kept bidding until the land was hers. Afterward, she found Vernon sitting alone in his truck, staring at nothing. I'm sorry, she said. Vernon laughed bitterly. Are you? You're the one who just bought my land. I'm sorry you lost it. I'm not sorry I was in a position to buy it. Vernon looked at her. This woman of 27, who had been a girl of 17 when he told her she'd fail in 3 months. How, he asked. How are you still standing when the rest of us are falling? I never borrowed money. That's it. That's the whole secret? That's most of it. Emma leaned against his truck, looking out at the land. His land, her land now. When my father died, everyone told me to sell. Everyone said I couldn't do it alone. So I decided I would do it alone, completely alone. No partners, no loans, no debt, just me and the land and whatever I could earn. That's not possible. You can't run a modern farm without credit. Apparently you can. It's just slower, harder. You don't expand as fast. You don't buy new equipment. You don't keep up with the neighbors. Emma shrugged. But when the crisis comes, and it always comes, you're not the one losing everything. Vernon was quiet for a long moment. I called you little girl, he said finally. At your father's funeral, I told you to sell. I remember. I was wrong. About everything. Yes, you were. Vernon started his truck. What are you going to do with my land? Farm it? Same as you did. Same as my father did with his. Emma stepped back from the truck. I'll take good care of it, Vernon, I promise. Vernon drove away without another word. He moved to Wichita, took a job at a feed store, and never farmed again. But he never forgot the girl who bought his land. Now let me tell you about Clyde Haskell, because his fall was harder. The John Deere dealership in Wellington closed in the summer of 19. Clyde had extended credit to half the farmers in the county, and half of them couldn't pay. The tractors he repossessed were worth less than what was owed on them. The inventory he couldn't sell was eating him alive. The bank took the dealership in August. Clyde was 63 years old, bankrupt, and facing the prospect of starting over with nothing. One afternoon in September, a woman walked into the empty showroom. Clyde was there, packing up the last of his personal items, preparing to hand over the keys. It was Emma Dawson. Mr. Haskell. Clyde looked at her. He hadn't seen her in years, not since he'd offered her $400 for her father's tractor and she'd thrown him off her property. She wasn't a girl anymore. She was 31 years old, tanned and weathered by a decade of farm work, with hands that showed calluses and strength. She wore work clothes, same as always. She drove the same Farmall Super C that her father had died beside 11 years ago. Miss Dawson. Clyde's voice was hollow. Come to gloat? No. Emma walked through the empty showroom, looking at the bare floors where tractors used to gleam. I came to make you an offer. Clyde laughed bitterly. An offer? For what? I don't have anything left to sell. This building, the land it sits on, the lot behind it. Emma turned to face him. I understand the bank's going to auction it next month. So I want to buy it. Before the auction, I'll pay fair market value, more than you'd get at auction, probably. Clyde stared at her. You want to buy my dealership? The building, not the business. I'm going to turn it into a repair shop, somewhere farmers can bring their equipment to get fixed instead of replaced. Emma smiled slightly. There's going to be a lot of old tractors that need fixing in the next few years. Not everyone can afford a new John Deere. A repair shop. Clyde shook his head. You're going to turn my dealership into a repair shop. Does that bother you? Clyde was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick. In 1974, I told you to sell your farm. I called you little girl. I said farming wasn't for women, and you'd come crawling back in 3 months. I remember. I offered you $400 for your father's tractor. I said it was a piece of junk. I remember that too. Now you're buying my dealership, with cash, I assume. Yes. Clyde sat down heavily on an empty crate. How did this happen? How did you survive when everyone else is failing? Emma sat down across from him, on another crate, like they were equals having a conversation instead of a victor and a vanquished. Mr. Haskell, do you know what you taught me? What? You taught me never to trust anyone who said I couldn't do something. You taught me that the people who laugh at you are usually the ones who don't understand what you're doing. And you taught me that new and shiny isn't the same as good and reliable. She looked around the empty showroom. You sold a lot of tractors in this building. Big, expensive, beautiful tractors. And farmers bought them because you told them they needed to, because you said the old ways were obsolete, because you made them feel ashamed of their paid-off equipment. I was selling what people wanted. You were selling what people thought they wanted. What they needed was different. Emma stood up. They needed to keep their old tractors running. They needed to stay out of debt. They needed to be more like the stubborn 17-year-old girl who wouldn't sell, instead of less. She extended her hand. I'll have my lawyer contact the bank about the building. I hope you find something good in whatever comes next, Mr. Haskell. I really do. Clyde shook her hand, unable to speak. Emma walked out of the dealership, climbed into her father's old Farmall, and drove away. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because that's when Emma's story became legend. Emma Dawson bought the dealership building and turned it into exactly what she'd promised, a repair shop for old equipment. She hired mechanics, trained young people, built a business that helped farmers keep their machines running, instead of replacing them every few years. She also kept farming. By 1989, she owned 320 acres, her original 160 plus the parcels she'd bought from neighbors who couldn't hold on, all paid for in cash. All worked with equipment that some people would call obsolete, but Emma called reliable. In 1991, at the age of 34, Emma finally found someone who saw her instead of her acres. His name was Thomas Reed. He was a mechanic who'd come to work at her repair shop. A quiet man, 10 years older than Emma, who had never farmed a day in his life, but who understood machines the way she did. "You're not like the other men who've come around," Emma told him one evening, after they'd spent 3 hours rebuilding a transmission together. "How so?" "The others wanted to marry a farm. You just want to hand me the right wrench." Thomas smiled. "I figure if you've been running this place for 17 years without anyone's help, you probably don't need me telling you what to do. But I can hand you wrenches. I'm good at that." They married that spring, in the same Methodist church where Emma had been baptized and her parents had been buried. The whole county came. Farmers who had once laughed at her, neighbors who had learned from her, young people she had hired and trained. Thomas never tried to take over the farm. He worked in the repair shop, raised their 2 children when they came along, and let Emma be exactly who she was, a farmer, a businesswoman, and the most stubborn person in Sumner County. Let me tell you about the photograph, because that's how people remember this story. In 2004, on the 30th anniversary of Robert Dawson's death, the Sumner County Historical Society decided to honor Emma Dawson for her contributions to the community. They wanted a photograph for their collection. Emma agreed, on one condition. The photograph was taken in front of her repair shop, the building that had once been Clyde Haskell's John Deere dealership. Emma stood in the center, 62 years old, weathered and strong. Beside her was the 1951 Farmall Super C that her father had died beside, that Clyde had offered $400 for, that had been running for 53 years. In her hand was a piece of paper, the deed to 320 acres, all owned free and clear. And behind her, lined up like a graduating class, were 37 people. Mechanics she had trained, farmers she had helped, young people who had come to her shop with nothing and left with a trade. The photograph hangs in the Historical Society to this day. The caption reads, "Emma Dawson, 1957-2019, farmer, businesswoman, teacher." When she was 17 years old, they told her to sell the farm and let the men handle things. She refused. She outlasted them all. Let me end this story where it began, at a funeral with a choice. Emma Dawson died in 2019 at the age of 62. Cancer, like her mother. She worked until the last month of her life, just like her father would have wanted. Her funeral was the largest in Sumner County history. They held it in the Methodist church, but half the mourners had to stand outside because there wasn't room for everyone. Her daughter, Sarah, gave the eulogy. "My mother was 17 years old when her father died," Sarah said. "She was alone, with a sick mother, on a farm that everyone said she couldn't run. They told her to sell. They told her a woman couldn't farm. They bet she wouldn't last 3 months." Sarah looked at the crowd, at the farmers and mechanics, the neighbors and friends, the children and grandchildren of people who had once laughed at Emma Dawson. "My mother didn't argue with them. She didn't try to convince them they were wrong. She just went out to the field and got to work. And she kept working for 45 years while everyone who laughed at her fell away." Sarah held up a photograph, the one from the Historical Society, Emma with her tractor and her deed and her 37 students. "This is what my mother built. Not just acres and buildings, but people. People who learned from her that you don't have to do things the way everyone else does, that being different isn't the same as being wrong, that a woman can do anything a man can do if she's stubborn enough to keep going when everyone says she can't." Sarah looked at the casket, draped in flowers. "Mom, you were the most stubborn person I ever knew, and I mean that as the highest compliment. When they told you to sell, you refused. When they laughed at you, you ignored them. When they failed, you helped them anyway, because you weren't interested in revenge. You were interested in proving something. She smiled through her tears. You proved it, Mom, 1,000 times over. Rest now. We'll take care of things from here. The Dawson farm is still operating today. Sarah runs it now, with her husband and children, the fourth generation of Dawsons on that Kansas land. They still use the old Farmall Super C for light work. They still fix their own equipment instead of buying new. They still pay for everything in cash. And every year, on the anniversary of Emma's father's death, they gather at the family cemetery. Robert, Grace, Emma, all together now, and they tell the story. The story of a 17-year-old girl who wouldn't sell. The story of the men who laughed at her and lost everything. The story of the woman who proved them wrong and helped them anyway. That's the kind of farmer Emma Dawson was. That's the kind of person worth remembering.